No matter where you are in America, sometimes the road less traveled is the one best traveled. We teamed up with Smithsonian Magazine to find small towns that stood out. We found historic sites on the Mississippi and modern art in West Texas, monuments on the Oregon coast, and battlegrounds in West Virginia. They are places that have bred heroes, inspired artists, and thrilled explorers. These are America's best small towns. Our journey begins in dusty West Texas, in a place Smithsonian Magazine calls a fly speck. Out of the desert emerges Marfa, a small town that's causing a sensation. In 1971, a famous American artist named Donald Judd arrived with his family and a truck full of his work. After years in New York, Judd craved clean, open spaces to display his art. He settled in this former Army office building. Next door, Judd created some of his first large pieces, like these 15 untitled works in concrete. He eventually installed them on the grounds of a former Army base, where he started a contemporary art museum. The 15-building complex, called the Chinati Foundation, now features a world-class collection, including this interpretation of a nail in a horseshoe. This old artillery shed contains some of Judd's best-known work. Inside are 100 aluminum boxes positioned to glisten in the stark Texas sunlight. Over 2 decades, Judd bought more than a dozen buildings here, gradually transforming Marfa into what it is today, one of the best towns in America for the arts. Small towns have inspired many of the country's greatest artists, including a former riverboat captain who immortalized small-town life on the mighty Mississippi. In 1857, Samuel Clemens, later known as Mark Twain, began piloting steamboats past places like Natchez, Mississippi. At the time, Natchez was home to some of the richest men in the country. They made their fortunes off cotton and slaves. In 1861, the Civil War broke out, halting river traffic and ending the ways of the Old South. Two decades later, Twain returned to Natchez and wrote that it was an attractive town and always had been. "500 antebellum homes still stand here, more than any place else in the U.S. They include the Melrose Estate, run by the National Park Service, and Dunlith, now an historic inn. The route out of Natchez is nearly as scenic as the town itself. The 444-mile Natchez Trace Parkway was built near the Natchez Trace, a trade route used by Native Americans and settlers. The modern road stretches north through Mississippi, not far from one of America's best literary small towns. This is Oxford, Mississippi, on the day of their annual double-decker arts festival. It's fitting for a place that Smithsonian magazine says prides itself on being an intellectual oasis. Oxford is home to Square Books, one of the country's best-known independent bookstores. Part of it is devoted to the town's most well-known resident, William Faulkner, who lived south of the square. A modern-day writer owes much of his fame to Oxford. In 1981, a young man named John Grisham earned his law degree from the University of Mississippi in Oxford. He later overheard a court case that inspired his first novel, A Time to Kill. Now, the fiction icon spends part of the year in this Victorian house. The grounds even include a place to play baseball, the author's favorite sport. Small towns help pave the way for big dreams in Mississippi and Maysville, Kentucky. In the 1940s, a teenager named Rosemary Clooney gazed at the Ohio River and dreamed of becoming a star. She made her singing debut at 13. By 20, she was famous, appearing with Bing Crosby in White Christmas and singing hit songs like Mambo Italiano. In 1982, she opened her Hollywood home to her nephew, George Clooney. He'd recently left nearby Augusta, Kentucky to study acting. In 2008, Clooney chose Maysville's Washington County Opera House for a red carpet screening of his movie Leatherheads. Outside, Clooney signed autographs, along with co-star Renee Zellweger. Small river towns have a way of changing history, whether they're in northern Kentucky or the neighboring state of West Virginia. Harper's Ferry sits at the juncture of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers. George Washington surveyed this land well before he was president. Decades later, Thomas Jefferson declared the view perhaps one of the most stupendous scenes in nature. Today, Harper's Ferry is one of America's most historic small towns. In 1859, a man named John Brown began a militia-style campaign he hoped would ultimately free the slaves. Brown and his 21-man army captured the town's bridges. Next, they stormed a U.S. armory. Its remains are still visible along the banks of the Shenandoah. The abolitionists took hostages to this brick building, now called John Brown's Fort. Marines, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, stormed the building and ended the campaign. Brown's raid set off a chain of events that 2 years later brought the first shots of the Civil War. That war raged in small towns from Harper's Ferry to Lewisburg, West Virginia, where every spring reenactors commemorate the Battle of Lewisburg. In May of 1862, Confederates launched a surprise attack here on Union forces. Despite being badly outnumbered, the Northerners won and seized hundreds of weapons, including a cannon. The battle gave a much-needed boost to Union morale. At the time, an ambitious young railroad worker was bringing supplies to Union forces. His name was Andrew Carnegie, and his legacy lives on in this historic small town at Carnegie Hall. After the steel baron made his fortune, he turned to philanthropy. Today, there are 4 Carnegie Halls. The others are in New York, Pittsburgh, and Scotland. This structure was originally part of a local women's college. It's now an arts and education center. America's best small towns have helped shape the country, particularly one in North Florida named St. Augustine. It's actually America's first small town. Spanish settlers founded it 4 decades before Jamestown. Today, Smithsonian magazine calls it a lovingly cared-for vestige of the Spanish New World. One of the best preserved structures is Castillo de San Marcos, the country's first masonry fort. It was built in the late 1600s, over 23 years. And it was never conquered, thanks to a 40-foot moat and double drawbridge entrance. St. Augustine is also home to a sprawling Spanish-style building that once catered to the rich and famous. Oil tycoon Henry Flagler began building the Hotel Ponce de Leon in 1885. He spared no expense. For the exterior, he chose a Spanish Renaissance Revival style. For the interior, he hired acclaimed artist Louis Comfort Tiffany, son of the man who founded Tiffany & Company. The Ponce marked the development of towns further south in Florida. Among them was one of America's best island towns, Key West. Ernest Hemingway and his second wife, Pauline, arrived here from Cuba in 1928, expecting to pick up a car. When it didn't arrive, they stayed for 3 weeks in a place Smithsonian magazine calls a haven for creativity. The young writer became fascinated with sport fishing, eventually hauling in 400-pound marlin. Hemingway later settled in this Spanish colonial home on Whitehead Street. He had some of his happiest years here, working in the morning and fishing in the afternoon. In the decade that followed, his distinct writing and masculine image brought him international fame. Hemingway later tried to escape that fame 3,000 miles away in Ketchum, Idaho. He was one of many celebrities first drawn here by the birth of American skiing. In 1935, in the midst of the Great Depression, Union Pacific Chairman Averell Harriman was looking for ways to help bolster the U.S. economy. He thought skiing would bring a much-needed new industry to the western states. Harriman wanted a place with dry powder, ample sun, and minimal wind. Most importantly, it had to be on the Union Pacific Line. After an exhaustive search, he chose Ketchum and hired a PR whiz who named it Sun Valley. A year later, Harriman opened the $1 million Sun Valley Lodge. One of its early guests was Hemingway, who stayed in room 206 and aimed his shotgun at geese from the balcony. In the years that followed, Hemingway kept coming back to Ketchum. He gambled at a wild casino called the Sawtooth Club, which still stands on North Main Street. In quieter moments, he went to Silver Creek to hunt or to fly fish with his son Jack. Tragically, in 1961, Hemingway took his own life in the foyer of his Sun Valley house. He's buried in a simple grave in the Ketchum Cemetery beneath 3 spruce trees. The American West is a land full of triumph and tragedy. And one businessman managed to capitalize on that in the 1890s. His name was William F. Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill. In 1896, he strategically founded the town of Cody, Wyoming, close to the country's first national park, Yellowstone. He predicted the park would attract a lot of visitors who'd need a place to stay. By then, Buffalo Bill was famous for his traveling show about the travails of the Old West. Cody has become one of the best gateway towns to Yellowstone, which stretches across northwest Wyoming into Montana and Idaho. Today, the park welcomes more visitors annually than even William Cody could have predicted. Three million people come through each year to see hydrothermal displays like Clepsydra Geyser, or to marvel at the natural formations such as the Grand Prismatic Spring. It gets its unusual coloring from different kinds of bacteria and how it reacts to sunlight. Another of America's best gateway towns sits on the southern side of Yellowstone. Jackson, Wyoming is in the valley of Jackson Hole, 60 miles south of the park. The town revolves around a unique square where Elkhorn gates have stood since 1960. They were constructed from antlers shed by bulls at the nearby National Elk Refuge. The square is also home to the $1 Million Cowboy Bar, the first Wyoming bar to get a liquor license after Prohibition. Now, this attractive small town has fewer cowboys and a lot more CEOs. North of Jackson, up the winding Snake River, is a stretch of land known as Billionaire's Row. Walmart heiress Christy Walton once owned a compound here, where homes have sold for up to $175 million. Some have direct access to the Jackson Hole Ski Resort. Its ski runs have a reputation for being some of the toughest in the country. One vertical drop apparently daunted even former astronaut John Glenn. In the off-season, an aerial tram whisks people to the top for views of Grand Teton National Park. Jackson serves as a hub for the park, which is home to some of the last untouched wilderness in America. It exists thanks in large part to John D. Rockefeller. He bought up 35,000 acres here in the 1930s and later donated it to the federal government. According to local legend, Rockefeller hiked these hills and envisioned a place where people could soak in the view. In 1955, Rockefeller's Jackson Lake Lodge opened its doors. The lobby's 60-foot windows overlook an area called Willow Flats. And beyond them, the 12,000-foot Mount Moran. Small towns opened up this midsection of the Rockies, whether they were in Wyoming or farther south in the range, in Colorado. The small town of Telluride began as a mining camp. Today, it's one of the best places to experience Colorado indoors and out. Every summer, Telluride hosts its famous film festival, where Juno and Slumdog Millionaire premiered. A local landmark is the new Sheraton Hotel, which catered to the influx of miners in the late 1800s, and today welcomes outdoor enthusiasts. Some head to a popular hiking spot a few miles outside town at Bridal Veil Falls. At 365 feet, it's the tallest free-falling waterfall in the state. These mountains are also home to the Durango and Silverton Railroad, located a few hours south of Telluride. The historic train runs from Silverton to Durango through the Cascade Canyon. It's been rumbling past rocky crags here since the late 1800s, when it was used by miners to haul gold and silver ore from the mountains. Precious metals drew miners to another Colorado town, later known for its glitzy celebrities. When prospectors first came to Aspen, they called it Ute City. A year later, the name was changed for the forests of aspen trees that grow here. It's now one of the best ski towns in America, thanks to the installation of a single-seat chairlift in 1946. Now, high-speed lifts and gondolas carry people up, and some of them paraglide back down. This small town has long given stars a respite from big city living. Actor Kevin Costner settled on this ranch after he spent decades searching for the perfect Western getaway. He now owns 165 acres outside Aspen, where he says he has the best view in the world. America's best small towns help people get away from it all. In the mountains of Colorado and amid the red rocks of Arizona. This is Sedona, in the heart of the vast Cocomino National Forest. These 1,200-foot spires make up Cathedral Rock, which some believe contains mystical powers. Legend has it that the central pillars are two lovers frozen in time for failing to appreciate each other. It's one of the many sites that's helped put Sedona at the center of the New Age movement. Smithsonian magazine says one of the town's most distinctive features is the sheer-walled Chapel of the Holy Cross. It was the vision of sculptor Marguerite Brunswick Stouty. For years, she wanted to create a church shaped like a cross. She finally found the perfect spot flying over Sedona. The building was completed in 1956 and immediately heralded as an architectural masterpiece. America's best small towns have helped people build big things in Arizona and in the neighboring state of New Mexico. Out of the desert emerges the small town of Las Vegas, not to be confused with the other Vegas in Nevada. In the late 1800s, the railroad arrived and brought with it an Englishman named Fred Harvey. He soon built the Grand La Castaneda Hotel. It was the crown jewel of his Harvey House hotels, a successful chain he started to help civilize the Wild West. It sits in one of 9 historic districts where Billy the Kid and Doc Holliday caroused in the early 1880s. You can still find rebels riding through the New Mexico desert. Particularly, in one of America's most unique small towns. This is Espanola, population 10,000. Over the years, it's built up a reputation for having some of the most souped-up cars in the state. Here, Mexican Americans celebrate their cultural heritage with lowriders. Customized cars that seem dangerously close to scraping the ground. Locals say the tradition stems from a ritual called paseo, when Mexican horsemen would decorate their saddles and ride around town. Generations of families work together to transform classic cars into works of art. In the summer, the cars are the centerpiece of a week-long celebration that commemorates the town's founding. Something about small New Mexico towns inspires artists, whether they express themselves on a car or a canvas. Taos, New Mexico is home to the San Francisco de Assis Mission Church, a favorite subject of famed American painter Georgia O'Keeffe. The artist, famous for her southwestern scenes and flowers, discovered Taos in her 40s. For 17 years, O'Keeffe came to Taos every summer, painting scenes in town and outside it. She stayed on a privately owned piece of land called Ghost Ranch, 60 miles southwest of Taos. It's now a 21,000-acre education center and home to one of O'Keeffe's most cherished spots, Kitchen Mesa. She loved the red and yellow cliffs of the 100-foot-tall rock formation and painted them many times. She also adored Pedernal, with its signature flattened mesa. When O'Keeffe died in 1986, at the age of 98, her ashes were scattered at the top. Smithsonian magazine says today, Taos still speaks to artists who come for the flash of a passing spirit and the quality of the light. Small towns have changed lives in the Southwest and across the country. In the lush foothills of New England, home to Montpelier, Vermont. It's the nation's smallest state capital, but it's helped change the course of history. Vermont was the first state to abolish slavery and the first to allow civil unions for gay couples. At the top of the Capitol Dome is Ceres, the goddess of agriculture. She stands above this historic town where residents brag there is no McDonald's. Instead, the people here opt for slow food, grown in this fertile valley and sold at picturesque farmers markets throughout the year. New England towns are known for forging new paths, both in Vermont and the neighboring state of Massachusetts. In 1620, the Pilgrims arrived at Cape Cod, and the first place they landed was Provincetown. In 1910, the Pilgrim Monument was dedicated in their honor, even though they ultimately settled across the bay in Plymouth. The granite structure overlooks what Smithsonian magazine describes as a splendidly intact 19th century village. P-Town later became known for its theater scene. Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, and Barbra Streisand all performed here as young actors. Surrounding Provincetown is Cape Cod National Seashore, 40 miles of pristine beaches that look much as they did when the Pilgrims sailed past. America's first small towns were in the east, but the development of western states began someplace surprising, in Marietta, Ohio. It's one of the best small towns in America to learn about the Revolutionary War. In 1788, a freedom fighter named Rufus Putnam arrived at the juncture of the Ohio and Muskingum rivers. He was among 48 veterans who ended up founding the first chartered city in the Northwest Territory. Many of those men are buried in Mound Cemetery, which is believed to hold more Revolutionary War officers than any place else in the country. It's centered around a Native American archaeological site, brought to attention by the Smithsonian Institution. This river town is also home to dozens of historic buildings that show how early pioneers lived when the nation was first forming. America's best small towns helped shape the country in the 18th century and the 20th. This is Wapakoneta, Ohio, the childhood home of Neil Armstrong. His family moved into this modest house when Armstrong was 14. During high school, the future astronaut worked at a local drugstore, earning 40 cents an hour. He used the money for flying lessons. In July 1969, Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. Space enthusiasts can get their fill of moon memorabilia at Wapakoneta's Armstrong Air and Space Museum. It features aircraft, a moon rock, and a Gemini capsule, which astronauts used to train for the famous Apollo missions. Small Midwestern towns have bred some of America's most beloved heroes, including a man known as Ike. This statue of President Dwight D. Eisenhower stands on the campus of his Presidential Library and Museum in Abilene, Kansas. Ike was raised in this white frame house, where Smithsonian Magazine says the seeds of the 1950s American dream were planted. The home is now part of the museum grounds. Eisenhower grew up poor in this Midwestern town and couldn't afford to go to college. 2 years after high school, he won an appointment to West Point. Abilene's sprawling Presidential Museum highlights his rise from second lieutenant to four-star general and ultimately commander-in-chief. In 1969, Eisenhower was laid to rest on the museum grounds in this small chapel. He lies alongside his wife, Mamie, and their first son, Dowd, who died at the age of 4 from scarlet fever. Throughout his life, Ike found comfort in a small Midwestern town, as did another man destined to become president. In 1883, a young Teddy Roosevelt got the urge to head west to North Dakota. Just 23 at the time, he boarded a train for the Badlands. He wanted to hunt buffalo before they disappeared. Roosevelt was so taken with North Dakota, he had a cabin built on the banks of the Little Missouri River. 5 months later, it became his refuge after he lost his mother to typhoid fever and his wife to kidney disease. They both died on Valentine's Day, 1884. The cabin now sits in the tiny town of Medora, which is at the center of the Teddy Roosevelt National Park. Medora serves as a hub for the thousands of visitors who want to walk in Roosevelt's footsteps and see this unspoiled landscape. Just outside town, Teddy's legacy lives on at the Burning Hills Amphitheater. It was built on the 100th anniversary of Roosevelt's birthday in 1958. Back then, Medora was in danger of becoming a ghost town. The theater helped revitalize it. Generations of local residents now work together to put on these high-energy Americana shows. This performance is about Roosevelt's days as a rancher, when Medora was still a rough and tumble town. The West was won in small towns, both in North Dakota and South Dakota, in places like Deadwood. It was the setting for the hit HBO series of the same name. Today, Deadwood is one of the best towns to revisit the Wild West, when this town was chock full of gunslingers and gold seekers. To impose order, a man named Seth Bullock was appointed Deadwood's first sheriff. He turned the town around and later built the Bullock Hotel on Main Street, which was considered one of the premier luxury hotels of the time. Nearby is Mount Moriah Cemetery, the final resting place of several notorious characters, such as Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane. Around the same time Deadwood was booming, a small town in southeast Minnesota was enjoying its golden age. Stillwater, on the banks of the St. Croix, was once a famous lumbering town. In the mid-1800s, logs would jam the peaceful river leading into Stillwater. Today, tourists ride steamboats reminiscent of that bygone era. The Anastasia is one of a handful of boats that still offers cruises up and down the St. Croix. Standing high above the river valley is the historic Washington County Courthouse. It was completed in 1870 after Stillwater was chosen as the county seat. The town grew rapidly as people poured in to take care of government and legal affairs. By 1900, Stillwater's boom was coming to an end. The surrounding forests were tapped out, and lumber mills along the river began to close. After World War II, people started coming back to this small town for the rich history and sweeping views of the St. Croix Valley, where the river is peaceful once again. 100 miles northwest of Stillwater is a small town that sparked the imagination of radio personality Garrison Keillor. Freeport, Minnesota inspired Keillor's stories about the fictional town of Lake Wobegon. They're a hallmark of his long-running radio show, A Prairie Home Companion. Keillor came to Freeport in 1970. At the time, he was a struggling writer looking for cheap rent. He lived outside town in a brick farmhouse with his wife and young son. Keillor was a regular at Charlie's Cafe, where the chili is homemade and the banana cream pie runs big. He modeled Lake Wobegon's sidetrack tap after the Pioneer Inn. Here, Keillor often had a beer and listened to the real-life characters who ultimately inspired his fictional ones. Small Minnesota towns have brought success to both writers and entrepreneurs. This is New Ulm, located in southern Minnesota. A German immigrant named August Schell helped found the town. Then opened up a brewery on the banks of the Cottonwood River. Over the years, he built the small company into a booming business. Today, it's one of the oldest surviving breweries in the country. Schell arrived in New Ulm with a group of immigrants looking to build a better life. They managed to preserve their heritage here with statues like this one. It depicts a German hero named Hermann, who symbolizes liberty and unity. The Cathedral of the Holy Trinity features German Baroque architecture. and this town's former post office is now home to the county's historical society. Small towns have often marked new beginnings in Minnesota and 800 miles away in Frankenmuth, Michigan. In 1845, 15 settlers from the German kingdom of Bavaria came here to support struggling German pioneers. Frankenmuth thrived, which led to the formation of 3 other German colonies in Michigan. More recently, this small town turned itself into Little Bavaria and draws nearly as many visitors each year as Yellowstone. They flock to the sprawling Bavarian Inn for the town's Christmas extravaganza. Local restaurants are known for their chicken dinners, which are so famous, Frankenmuth has become the #1 consumer of chicken in the world. America's best small towns offer up unexpected surprises in Michigan and Wisconsin. This is New Glarus, better known as Little Switzerland. In 1845, Swiss pioneers built a wooden hut where the Swiss United Church of Christ now stands. They came here to escape an economic crisis in their own country. In the decades that followed, more Swiss immigrants arrived. They built chalet-style homes and businesses and preserved their native food and traditions. Today, local restaurants serve up Switzerland's signature dish, fondue, but with Wisconsin cheese. One of the more recent additions to Little Switzerland is the New Glarus Brewing Company, located south of town. It's the first brewery in the country to be founded by a woman. Deborah Carey started the business in 1993 and turned it into a multi-million-dollar company. Today, local musicians are playing an instrument called an alpenhorn, which Swiss farmers use to communicate across alpine valleys. The Careys' small business success impressed even the White House. Deb Carey met with President Barack Obama on small business issues in 2012. America's best small towns can steal the political spotlight in the Midwest and more than 2,000 miles away on the California coast. This is Carmel by the Sea, which made headlines in 1986 when actor Clint Eastwood was elected mayor. The native Californian has long called this small town home. As mayor, Eastwood helped preserve the natural beauty here. This coastline is home to some of the richest marine life in the state. South of town is the Carmelite Monastery, where Catholic nuns devote themselves to a life of prayer and meditation. Visitors can come to this scenic spot. Public Mass is held 6 days a week. Two hours up the Pacific coast is a small town once known for sex, drugs, and rock and roll. During World War II, Sausalito, California, just north of San Francisco, was a hub for shipbuilding. When the war ended, the shipyards were abandoned and artists moved in. Using scavenged parts, they began to build a houseboat community. But Smithsonian magazine says Sausalito got its true cultural stamp in the 60s with the arrival of hippie refugees. Many artists still live on these waters, though the houseboats have gone significantly more upscale. Small port towns like Sausalito brought big changes to America in the 60s and more than a century earlier in a town nestled in Oregon's northwest corner. Astoria sits at the mouth of the Columbia River, where massive vessels enter from the Pacific. One of the best-known local landmarks is the Astoria Column, which stands at the town's highest point. Citizens raised more than $1 million to restore it. The artwork shows interactions between European settlers and Native Americans, as well as the arrival of Lewis and Clark. They arrived here in the winter of 1805, at the end of a long journey exploring the uncharted West. The waters around Astoria are known for being treacherous. The Peter Iredale ran aground on this coastline in 1906 when she couldn't escape strong winds and currents near the Columbia River entrance. Her rusting remains were featured in the 2009 film The Road. America's best small towns have great stories to tell, whether they're in Oregon or Washington State. In the 1990s, Roslyn became a main filming location for the hit show Northern Exposure. The series was about a New York doctor sent to practice in a remote Alaskan village. The show's producers thought Roslyn's scenic location made it the perfect stand-in for a small Alaska town. The Roslyn Cafe was even featured in the opening credits. But this town has a rich history beyond Hollywood. Native Americans inhabited this land until 1886, when white men discovered coal here. Immigrants worked and died in Roslyn's mines. Many are buried in the sprawling Roslyn Cemetery. It's made up of 26 separate cemeteries belonging to different ethnic groups. The diversity in small towns has led to both cooperation and conflict. This is Sitka in southern Alaska. In the late 1700s, a Russian named Alexander Baranov was so impressed by the natural resources here, he started a settlement. But soon, disagreements arose between settlers and local Native Americans. This small town was a battleground until 1804, when Baranov attacked at what's now the Sitka National Historical Park. It was the last major fight between the Europeans and the Native Americans on the Pacific coast. Today, Smithsonian magazine says no other town in the 49th state has Sitka's charisma. St. Michael's Cathedral contains one of the largest collections of Russian icons in the U.S. Sitka is also home to a remarkable collection of totem poles, donated to the town by Native American leaders throughout Alaska. Many tell unique stories about the first inhabitants of this rich and rugged land. "3,000 miles south of Sitka, Native people built their nation from a small town. In the late 1700s, Hawaii's king chose Lahaina as its capital. His family ruled here for 2 decades, as Lahaina was transformed into a whaling town. Hundreds of sailors came to local bars and dance halls. Among them was Herman Melville, author of Moby Dick. The whaling industry ended in Hawaii in the 1860s. Now, hundreds of humpback whales migrate to these warm water breeding grounds. They're just one of the many unexpected things you can find in America's best small towns. Whether they sit in the sparkling waters of the Pacific or amid the still water of Minnesota, these are the places where immigrants started fresh and businessmen dreamed big. Small towns have given America's artists room to breathe, and its literary giants space to think. They are the backbone and the heartbeat of a nation built one town at a time.